His name is Sylvester Stallone. He's the star of a new film called Rocky. He's been described as tough, handsome, talented, sexy, sensitive, dynamic, brilliant. He's been compared to Nicholson, De Niro, and Brando, but he is Rocky. He's the man who could be loved by only one woman because somehow she gets beneath the pain. He's every nobody who ever needed somebody.
Rocky, do you believe that America is the land of opportunity?
Yeah.
Welcome to another edition of History Through Film Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Allen, and today I have the privilege and honor of having my co-host, Alex Winkler, with me. Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the invite.
Well, we are tackling the Rocky franchise, and we're going to try to get into a little bit of the history of the Rocky films, a little bit of behind-the-scenes storytelling, the story of Rocky itself and the films, and of course, the history of what was going on during the release of the films. This is one of my favorite franchises. You know, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, we've already talked about that. Rocky, I can remember as a kid distinctly. I don't remember the first time I saw Rocky, 1976 Rocky, but I do remember my sister having the Rocky poster on her wall or closet door in the bedroom. And quite frankly, when movies stick out in my head as to when I first saw them, I can remember, you know, some of the greats like Jaws and Star Wars, but I don't remember the first time I saw Rocky. I do remember liking it. And of course, Rocky 2 and then 3 and 4, I saw in the theaters for sure. What about you, Alex? What's your first experience with Rocky?
You know, I was a little kid when I saw it. I can't remember how old I was, probably 7 or 8, maybe 6. I don't know. But I remember watching it in my basement with my 2 older brothers. So that's been kind of the, a memory that I have is watching Rocky with my older brothers. They were quite a bit older than me, actually. So, just a memory I have watching, the bouts against Apollo and Clubber all the way through that bout against that Soviet Ivan Drago that is completely quintessential Rocky Balboa.
He must break us.
But I was young. I don't remember the first time I saw it, but I do remember watching it in the basement of my house with my brothers. So a good memory for me.
Rocky's one of those films that you have seen probably numerous times, and you never can really remember the first time. What's interesting about our perspective, and I think we pointed this out, and I'm obviously a little older than you are, and what I find fascinating about Rocky films is that they really do kind of extend through different generations. For instance, in my class where we have watched Rocky before to kind of talk about the context and history of 1976, I find that my junior and senior students have seen it. I'm sure their parents had something to do with them seeing it. But the idea that now Rocky is sort of reborn with the Creed films, it's just great to see kind of like other films like Star Wars and some of the other ones that they're bringing back, that they're kind of passed on to a new generation. And in fact, in my class, just a little bit about how I teach Rocky is we look at of course, 1976 being the bicentennial birthday of the United States. We look at the theme of the American dream, the idea that, every U.S. citizen has this opportunity to achieve it. And Rocky really is steeped in that theme of the American dream. It does kind of help, if we're going to talk a little bit about history and the context, what was happening in 1976? Well, Alex, you teach this. I don't know how far you guys get in American history, but of course, some of the big things that were going on, the Vietnam War had officially come to an end by that time. And the United States was still getting over Watergate, the Watergate scandal. Mm-hmm. And the oil embargo, the Arab oil embargo, I can vaguely remember adults talking about that. I was young, of course, but the idea of those lines at the gas stations and just the lack in, really it was kind of a dark time in the United States, it seemed like.
Well, yeah, the 60s were such a turbulent time in this country, so much change happening. And then Vietnam gets in full swing, we could spend hours talking about the decade that was the 1960s.
Yeah.
And so, the first 5 years or so of the 1970s, it's almost like America is slumped down in its chair, wondering what just happened the past decade.
Yeah, and not only did you have like stagnation of the recession going on in the early 70s, but on top of that, it was almost as if what else could happen. One of the other things that we look at in one of my other classes, we talk about crimes and cults in the 1970s. It just seemed like the 70s were steep with coming off of Charles Manson and, the Zodiac Killer and the Hillside Strangler and Ted Bundy. Every generation can look at the problems that they had in a country, but it just seemed like for some reason the 70s were pretty unique. The 70s were also kind of known as the me generation. I don't really remember that as a child, but I do remember that it was kind of fueled by self-help, self-interest. We kind of got away from, helping the world from the 60s. There was kind of a mind shift change in the 70s as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would. Obviously, I didn't live through it. But what I can say is that, the 60s, the helping the world, changing the world. But then you go through Vietnam, you kind of go through, the Arab oil embargo, and you have to sit back and think, man, what are we doing to protect ourselves? What am I doing to help myself? What can I do to help myself get ahead? Yeah, the world might have all these problems, but it's got to start at home.
Yeah. And like I said, if you're going to focus on Rocky, the film itself, you got to look at the year that it was released. And it's no coincidence that 1976 is the perfect time for Rocky, a film like Rocky, to be released. If you look at films of the 70s, and in fact, we may touch on this with Star Wars because George Lucas kind of mentioned this, a lot of the films were kind of dark and bleak, and you had like Taxi Driver, and you had, of course, The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola. You even had the Godfather films, and those weren't exactly depressing, but what I'm saying is you had these tones of films that were kind of dark, bleak, that really reflected the attitudes of the 70s. And then all of a sudden you have this small independent film that came out of nowhere, of course, called Rocky. Sylvester Stallone just came out of nowhere to write this film. He was broke. He was a struggling actor. He had been in a few films. In fact, one that stands out to me, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but one of Woody Allen's films, I think it's Bananas, where he's on a subway and Sylvester Stallone plays one of the thugs that is kind of harassing this lady, and in a typical Woody Allen kind of comedy scene, he's just kind of sitting there minding his own business on the subway while these guys are accosting this woman. It sounds horrible, but in a Woody Allen way, he's trying to avoid getting entangled with these thugs. Stallone plays one of the thugs. So he had just small bit parts like that where he kind of played the heavy. And the heavy is kind of a term for somebody that's like, a muscular thug that's going to probably intimidate somebody in a scene, or, like a gangster type person. And that's really what he did, was he was kind of stuck with those roles. That all changed when he got an idea to write the script for Rocky. In fact, as the story goes, it was kind of based on a famous Muhammad Ali and Chuck Wepner fight in 1975. Have you heard of this fight before?
I have heard of it.
This was a fight that Chuck Wepner, who, by the way, I will say there's a new film called that just came out based on Chuck Wepner's life with Liev Schreiber. I haven't seen it yet, heard it's really good, so I do want to check that out. But the idea was Ali just needed somebody to fight, and this was going to be a typical Ali knockout in probably 2 rounds. This turned into something a little bit more. Actually, Wepner took Ali the distance, all 15 rounds. In the last 20 seconds of the fight, Ali was able to get a TKO over Chuck Wepner. Wepner actually knocked Ali down in the fight as well. And as the story goes, this is kind of where the idea of Rocky was born. Who knows how much of that is truth or not, but it seems that this was the true inspiration, the 1975 fight that inspired Stallone to write the idea for Rocky.
Well, Apollo Creed, who obviously is going to be taken from Muhammad Ali, they exhibit very similar tendencies.
Yes.
Both are incredibly smooth in the ring. I mean, Ali was very, very smooth in the ring. And maybe the greatest of all time, one could argue, or certainly up there in the discussion. And when the film begins, Apollo Creed is the greatest boxer in America.
And the charisma. I mean, Ali, we could go on and on about Ali, and our listeners probably know, of course, if they're old enough to remember Muhammad Ali. But what was even more effective about Ali is he was so good on the mic.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, half of the battle is, intimidation and playing mind games, and Ali certainly did that. And of course, Apollo Creed, Carl Weathers, just captures that essence of Muhammad Ali, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. What's interesting about the Rocky film is Stallone has this script, he's shopping it around, and rumor has that as Stallone was shopping this script around, he literally had $106 in his bank account. Some of the studios offered him about $100,000 if they would just sell the script and let him walk away. Well, he did not want that because Stallone wanted to be in the film. He was an actor, a struggling actor. He knew he could do the part. So it was almost like a package deal. If you want my script, I'm going to be in the movie. Nobody would buy it. He shopped it around. And this is where you get a little bit into the true rags to riches story that not only encompasses the story behind Rocky, but also encompasses the story behind Sylvester Stallone. It truly is art imitating life and life imitating art when you think about it. Most studios were looking for a named actor, somebody like a James Caan, a Burt Reynolds.
His name pops up quite frequently in the 70s and 80s.
Yes. That's before he was known as Turd Ferguson.
That's right.
And Robert Redford was another. I don't know. Can you see any of those guys playing? Maybe James Caan, because James Caan, I think, has that boxer look, from the Godfather films. But I could not see Robert Redford playing this part. And, Burt Reynolds, maybe. But I think history would have shown something a lot different. We probably would have had a one and done Rocky, and that's what we'd be left with.
Yeah, I think, one reason why I think Stallone playing Rocky is obviously a better choice than any of these three is because Stallone's life is mirroring Rocky. He can put more passion into the part, and he knows he can be inside of the character more than anybody else could. I mean, maybe Connor, maybe Reynolds if Rocky wasn't from Philly, but I can't picture a Burt Reynolds from Philadelphia.
No,
that doesn't really strike me as the right character for that.
No, the right decision was made, and the idea that Rocky was finally put into production, there were some restrictions. They agreed to give Stallone the part. They were only going to give him about $1 million budget, just a little over $1 million. And even by 1970 standards, that's considered a low-budget film. To put it into perspective, the following year, Star Wars would be released, and Star Wars, considered a small science fiction film, had a budget of about $11 million. So you're talking about a true art independent film when it comes to Rocky, a budget of just over $1 million. And in fact, Stallone did not really get that much of a paycheck, just knowing that he could star in the film that he wrote. And then, of course, we get the rest of the cast. We mentioned Carl Weathers as Apollo Creed. Perfect casting.
Absolutely.
And of course, that would propel Carl Weathers into stardom as well. We get Talia Shire, and we've seen her before. She was in the Godfather films. Of course, she is the sister of Francis Ford Coppola. So she's somewhat had an established career. Burt Young had been in some films as well as Paulie. He's going to be Paulie, Adrian's brother and Sylvester Stallone's, future brother-in-law. And then we've got Burgess Meredith. Burgess Meredith was, of course, a scrappy character actor. We've seen him in some other films, best known as
The Penguin.
Yes,
The Penguin in the original Batman.
I mean, he's just great. And Burgess Meredith was, again, just a perfect. I mean, all these are perfect casting choices. But Burgess Meredith would go on to get, be nominated for Academy Award, just like most of these actors would be. I think the only one not nominated was Carl Weathers, but Adrian or Talia Shire, Burt Young, Burgess Meredith, all nominated, along with Sylvester Stallone as Best Actor as well. So there is our basic cast of characters. One thing that I like to mention in my class is who these characters kind of represent. We know that Apollo Creed is a form of Muhammad Ali. He's kind of a satirizing clown. He publicly mocks Rocky, somewhat mocking the idea of the American dream. And we'll get into that in just a little bit too, because from Apollo's perspective, his idea of the American dream is a little different than Rocky's. Paulie, of course, is the lower white middle class worker, kind of the blue collar guy. Paulie's angry all the time. Why is he angry?
He is angry all the time, and he's kind of thrown together in his appearance. He doesn't really seem to care too much about what he looks like or what he puts himself out there to be. He's just his own person.
I think we all have a Paulie in our life. You know, somebody that's angry with their situation, kind of blames everyone except themselves. But that's what's great about Paulie, too, is as these movies progress, he grows a little bit, right? His character kind of comes to an arc. Mickey, of course, is the tough, crusty manager. Obviously, he's doubting Rocky's determination. He's berating Rocky from time to time, but he knows Rocky has something inside of him, of course, that he just needs to get out to reach his full potential. A little like metaphorically, I think, for the United States at this time, maybe.
Well, Mickey's he would have also lived through the Depression.
Yes, he
and
would
that obviously influenced his determination, his toughness, the get up, get back. What are you doing? Why are you giving up? You have to keep going. And I mean, that's America and the Depression. So
that
true. Obviously weighs on his character as well.
Yeah, a little bit of that difference of attitude from a generation. And of course, we have Adrian. What's interesting about Adrian when you watch Rocky is how she transforms from a shy, mousy pet shop employee to somebody who finally takes off her glasses. And she's probably one of the most interesting characters in all the Rocky films because she is the rock in Rocky's life. She is the one that pushes him in every film. It kind of almost becomes cliche where they have their little talk before the fight or something that happens. But when you watch the original Rocky, what's interesting about her scenes is that she's always hiding behind things. The way she's shot, either hiding behind a cage or she's hiding behind her glasses and she's hiding behind her attire or she's always covered up. So you see her kind of come out of her shell as a character as well in these films. We've touched on this before, but Rocky is an underdog story about the American dream. The story of how Rocky was made is just as important as Rocky because Rocky is the real-life underdog that was trying to make a film about an underdog, which is wrapped in an American dream. I know there's a lot of repeating right there.
America loves an underdog story.
Haven't we always?
We don't make movies about teams or dynasties that keep winning and winning and winning
That's
and winning.
true.
We love we are pulling to the underdog story.
Yeah, that is true. And by 1976, the mood of America had changed from worries of Watergate, Vietnam, and stagflation to optimism. And a lot of that was due to, again, the 200th birthday. It was like, hey, we got something to look forward to. U.S. News and World Report even declared back in 1976, nowhere on earth do the hopes for the future appear more exciting than they do in the U.S. Rich in spirit, power, and people. Awesome. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about Rocky, the film itself. Just real quickly, it was, again, the budget was around $1 million. It was shot in 28 days. Real locations in Philadelphia.
Take it back. Do-do-do-do. Take it back. Do-do-do. I said I've been told by do-do-do-do some people and they all said take it back.
Sometimes they didn't even have permits. They would just show up. And that's what's great about Rocky. I'll emphasize something that I've said before in not only my class, but you'll hear over again in this podcast. What I like to do is look at films that are made in specific time periods. And when you do that, you can actually see what cities, people, things, objects, locations were like during that time period. And I think Rocky is one of the best films that captures what Philadelphia looked like back in 1976. Because again, they didn't have the money to set up a lot of scenery. Basically, they shot on location, and some of the people you see were unknown actors or just extras that were thrown into the situation. And it really did capture kind of the essence of Philadelphia and Rocky's life as well.
Well, there were scenes that had to be Stallone rewrote because the film didn't have the budget for it.
Yeah.
You know, the ice skating rink scene, they did not have the budget to hire the extras for it. So they basically convinced the ice rink owner to let them come in and shoot it after the ice rink closed, so they didn't have to pay to bring in all the extras during the day.
Aren't you skating?
Nah, I ain't skated since I was 15. You know, that's when I started fighting. When I was 15. Skating's kind of bad for the ankles, you know?
Yeah.
You're a pretty good skater, aren't you? You know, like I was saying before on the way over here, you know, fight used to be tossing me, but no more, you know? See, all I wanted to do out of fight was prove I was no bum, that I had the stuff to make a good pro, you know?
You never got the chance?
Oh, hey, you know, I ain't crying about it, because I still fight. I kind of do it like a hobby. See, I'll tell you what the trouble is. You see, I'm a southpaw.
What's a southpaw?
Oh, southpaw means you're left-handed, and southpaw throws your timing off, you see?
Speaking
Other
of
guys,
budget
time off,
and kind of shooting on the fly, I know we're jumping around a little. Something that's really interesting is one of the last scenes the night before the fight where Rocky comes into the ring and he's kind of looking around as the arena is empty. And the promoter walks in. And one of the first things Rocky does is he looks up at the banners that are hanging in the arena. And he notices that the color of his shorts are wrong.
Rocky, what brings you here tonight?
Mr. Jergens, the poster's wrong.
What do you mean?
Well, I'm wearing white pants with a red stripe.
It doesn't really matter, does it? I'm sure you're going to give us a great show. Try to get some rest, kid. Good night.
And what's interesting about that scene is, one, from behind the scenes, they already had those banners made before the last fight scene was shot. They didn't have the budget to switch it, so that was almost like a printer's error. But what's great about that scene is the fact that the promoter says, does it really matter? Because as we know, who's going to win the fight? You know, Apollo's going to knock him out in the first round, right? That's what everybody thinks, of course. And that's what's so powerful about that small little intimate scene is the promoter going, does it really matter? In other words, do you really even have a shot against this guy? But let's talk about movie. Let's talk about the Rocky movie. We're not going to go into depth as we would because we've got others to talk about as well. But Rocky, what about it? What sticks with you in the first film?
I mean, it's the underdog story. We hit on it once already. It's the 1 in a million shot. It's the odds are completely stacked against Balboa. A fight that he had no business being in the first place. He should have never been given a chance to even fight in that type of setting. But yet he's given the chance to fight, and I think it appeals to maybe the element inside a person that says, if I just work hard, or if I work hard and do what I need to do, then maybe a break's going to fall my way.
We need to mention Bill Conti's legendary score. Right from the beginning, with the trumpets starting that Rocky theme, you're kind of in your seat going, this is inspirational. You almost want to get up out of your seat and just go jogging or something. And it opens in kind of a shady, seedy boxing ring where we meet Rocky as kind of a beaten down older boxer who's just trying to box his way to stay alive. And that's where we, of course, learn more about him. We don't know much about his past. We don't know anything about his parents, really. We get that shot of Rocky staring at the mirror where he sees himself as a young man, a little boy, in fact. And you kind of wonder, that's a great scene because you kind of wonder, what's the past of this guy? He's got such a big heart, such a soft-spoken guy. Also in that scene, we gotta mention Cuff and Link. We meet the two turtles. Those are some of the reoccurring characters that are going to pop up later on. As he meets Adrian, he knows Adrian, pops into the pet store.
How you feeling this morning, huh? Full of life.
Fine.
Hey, how you doing, killer? How's the turtle food this week?
Fine.
Me, I'm kind of aggravated, you know?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's your fault. I'm just kind of aggravated. You know, you want to hear about it?
I'll tell you somebody you don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, you doing, Lloyd? You know, the last turtle food I got here had more moss in it than flies. You know that, Adrian? And these moths, they get caught in the turtle's throat right about here in his cough, right? I gotta smack them on the back of the shell, and what do you think they get? Huh? And they get what? Huh? Go what? Show shot. They get show shot. What do you think?
You're starting with the bad jokes early, huh?
Well, no, I just inventing jokes ain't so easy sometimes.
No, no one knows.
Hey, how's my buddy doing today? Yo, Budkins!
Ain't that time to
Yo,
chat.
Budkins!
In and around this pet shop scene, we also see what Rocky does on a daily basis. He's kind of a muscle, plays a collection agent with a local loan shark, Gazzo, who's played by the great Joe Spinelli. Joe Spinelli was in The Godfather 1 and 2, of course, Rocky 1 and 2, also Taxi Driver. He's a great character actor and such a fun character in this film. But Rocky's job is to go around and collect, and sometimes he doesn't exactly do what he's told by Gazzo, but that's just the big heart of Rocky. We also see Rocky in and out of the boxing training facility that Mickey owns, and this is where we get a good glimpse as to Rocky and Mickey's relationship. You can tell that Mickey sees something inside of Rocky, but Rocky isn't maybe using his full potential.
Hey, you got something for me?
Yeah, there was some guy here from Miles Juergens looking for you. They need sparring partners for Apollo Creed.
Put me on.
Here's the car.
When was it here?
About an hour ago.
They're probably looking for sparring partners for Creed, you know?
I said that before, you dumb dago.
You know, I've been coming in for 6 years, and 6 years you've been sticking it to me. I want to know how come.
You don't want to know.
Yeah, I want to know how come.
You want to know?
I want to know how.
Okay, I'm going to tell you. Because you had the talent to become a good fighter. And instead of that, you became a leg breaker. Some cheap, second-rate loan shark.
It's a living?
It's a waste of life.
And this exchange between Rocky and Mickey sets up the idea that Apollo's people are looking for Rocky to possibly give him a shot at the title. And he gets that shot. A boxer that was going to face Apollo Creed is injured. And of course, this is where you get into the theme of the American dream. From Apollo's perspective, he just wants to give a nobody a shot at the title.
I'll tell you why. Because I'm sentimental. And a lot of other people in this country are just as sentimental, and there's nothing they'd like better than to see Apollo Creed give a local Philadelphia boy a shot at the greatest title in the world on this country's biggest birthday. Now, that's the way I see it. And that's the way it's gonna be.
Apollo, I like it. It's very American.
No, Juergens. It's very smart.
What's more American than that?
Well, it's setting himself up to, I mean, Creed has no doubt in his mind that he's going to win the match. It's almost like, yeah, I'm letting a guy get famous from fighting me. He's not going to win, but he's going to get famous, and good for him. I'm still going to be the champ, and I'm still going to get paid, and I'll leave the film, or I'll leave the ring, and nothing's going to change for me except maybe I helped the guy out.
You know what's interesting about what you just said there is one of the things that I also kind of ask my students is Rocky is famous for its training montages, of course. And
Absolutely.
There's a couple of them in Rocky. We never see Apollo Creed train. And in fact, in most of these films, we do later on in 3 and 4 and so forth, but we don't see a lot of Apollo Creed. We don't see any of Apollo Creed training in Rocky 1 at all. And I always ask my students, I said, do you see something underlying in that idea? Is there a stereotypical kind of feeling that, well, look at Apollo Creed. He's almost like the perfect specimen. He's that African-American athlete that has natural talent and doesn't need to train. Or do you think it was just not part of the story because we're focusing on Rocky? Any thoughts on that?
You know, I think you could throw both of them in there. It does set up the whole American dream of hard work's going to get you there, because we don't see Creed train. One, we don't see Creed train for we don't really see him train for Rocky IV either before he goes and fights Drago.
Did he take dance lessons?
I don't know if he took dance lessons. I don't know if him and James Brown were hanging out before that. More on the dance montage later, of course. We cannot forget about that. But you don't see him train. And it could be purposeful in the sense that Carl Weathers is obviously a tremendous athlete. He played in the NFL. And Apollo Creed, I mean, just you look at him and he is as athletic as can be. Also it shows that Rocky's not just relying on his natural ability.
Yeah.
Because obviously he has some. But again, it's the hard work, it's the grit and the grind, and that the hard work's going to beat the one that doesn't work hard, even if maybe they are more talented than you.
We also get a glimpse into the relationship between Rocky and Paulie, which throughout the films is a little rough and almost like a brotherly love relationship. And of course, that progresses throughout all the films. And what Rocky does a really good job of, the film itself, is establishing that relationship between Paulie and Adrian. Paulie kind of is the same character throughout most of the films, although he grows a little bit and he becomes lovable. And Adrian, though, from Rocky until the end of like Rocky IV, definitely becomes the stronger character and does probably the most growing character arc. She comes from a mousy, quiet person into really the rock behind Rocky and the rock of their relationship. She becomes such a strong character that's always there behind him. And you kind of see it in this scene where Paulie comes home, of course, after drinking again, feeling sorry for himself and doesn't want help from anybody. And this is finally where Adrian stands up for herself that we've been waiting for her to do.
This Paulie keeps asking me for a job all the time, but he don't know nothing about fighting.
Are you going to say anything to him?
What to say? I just don't know what he wants from me.
I don't want nothing from you. I don't want nothing from you. This ain't no charity case. Get out of my house.
It's not just your house.
You're no friend no more. Get out of my house, I just said.
Don't talk to him like that.
Both of you get out of my house.
Yo. It's cold outside, Paulie.
I don't want you missing her. And I don't raise you to go with this scumbag. Yeah, come on. You want to hit on me? Come on. I'll break both your arms so they don't work for you. That's right, I'm not good enough to meet with Gazzo. Ooh, that's what I think of Gazzo. Now you're a big shot fighter on the way up. You don't even throw a crumb to your friend Paulie. When I go and get your meat every morning, you forgot that night I even give you my sister too.
Auntie would say that!
I'm a pig. A pig gets you the best. You're like a loser. I don't get married because of you. You can't live by yourself. I put you two together and you. Don't you forget it. You owe me. You owe me.
Why do I owe you?
You're supposed to be good to me.
What do I owe you, Paulie? What do I owe you? I treat you good. I cook for you. I clean for you. I pick up your dirty clothes. I take care of you, Paulie. I don't owe you nothing. And you made me feel like a loser. I'm not a loser.
And Adrian moves on to become the strong character that we know that she is in the rest of the Rocky films. And around the same time, after this scene, we also know that Rocky is going to smooth over his relationship with Mickey. And this is an interesting scene inside Rocky's apartment. Mickey kind of arrives with his tail between his legs, knowing that Rocky has a shot. And what's awesome about this scene is we also see how vulnerable Mickey is. He also wants some redemption. He sees himself as a broken down manager, fighter from the past. He also wants to redeem himself to show that he has what it takes to lead Rocky to success.
Hello, kid. I seen your light. Can I come in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, good. Hey, it's a nice place here. All right. Anyway, what I come to tell you is that what happened to you is freak luck.
Yeah, freak luck.
Ain't it
sure.
true? Look
Yeah.
at the other guys.
Now, they're good fighters, right? They're colorful. They got good records. They fight their guts out for peanuts. But you get a shot at the title.
Yeah, freak luck is a strange thing.
Yeah, sure it is. Can I sit down?
Yeah, sure.
What the hell are those?
Oh, those are the domestic turtles. The one on the top is Cuff and the other guy is Link, and the rest of them are marbles.
Yeah, they make good soup. Anyway, look, I'm here to warn you that you gotta be very careful about this shot that you got at the title. Because, I don't know, like the Bible says, you ain't gonna get a second chance.
Yeah, all right.
You thought of that, huh? Well, what you need is a manager. A manager, listen to me. I know, because I've been in this racket for 50 years.
Mickey goes on to tell Rocky a little bit about his past, but Rocky's not buying it.
The fight's set.
Listen to me, I want to be your manager. You follow that, do you?
The fight's set. I don't need no manager.
But you can't buy what I'm going to give you. I mean, I've got pain and I've got experience.
Yo, I got pain. I got experience, too.
Listen, kid.
Hey, look,
Yes,
hey,
people.
Mick.
What?
Look, I need your help about 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago?
Right.
You never helped me. You didn't care.
Well, if you wanted help. I say, if you wanted help, why didn't you ask? Why didn't you just ask me, kid?
Look, I asked, but you never heard nothing.
Well, I'm 76 years old.
And in this scene, we go on to see Rocky kind of unload his frustrations on Mickey, but eventually they make up and Mickey's going to be his trainer. And that's what leads us to the rest of the film with the training montages, which of course are great. And we move into the actual title shot where he is going to get the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to stand toe-to-toe with the champ. In fact, one of the questions that I ask my students at the end of the film is, does Rocky win? Well, he does. He did what he set out to do. He says earlier in the film, all I want is a chance to go toe-to-toe with the best in the world and go the distance. And Rocky does. Now, did he really win the fight? I think he did.
Well, what makes he lost on the scorecard.
Yes.
And which is what makes the film, I think, even better.
Oh, yeah.
Because we see so many movies where the end of the film is just
very predictable.
Very predictable. Oh, he's going to get a nod. He's going to win. And in terms of overall greatness of the film, the first Rocky might be the best out of the whole
Absolutely.
series. Because a great story doesn't have to have a happy ending where everything is perfectly worked out. That story could have ended with Rocky knocking out Apollo Creed. But it didn't. It didn't have to. And so it makes it a better story because it's not the way, it's not the message.
It would
story
not have
wanted
been
to
the
say.
same movie at all. And in fact, he does win because, again, he gets, Rocky is a love story if you really peel away all the layers of it. And yes, he gets Adrian, she runs in, Rocky, of course, they're yelling for each other, I love you, and that's how the film ends. And we know as movie watchers, as the audience, that Rocky really, he kind of kicked Apollo's butt and he wins, but that's not the whole point. The point of it isn't whether Rocky won the fight or not. That was an exhibition fight where Apollo was never going to lose, but Rocky does win in the end. And that's where you get into the art imitating life kind of scenario because Sylvester Stallone won. He goes from nowhere, an underdog, gets this film made, stars in it. It's made on a $1 million budget, goes on to win Best Picture and Best Director, and gets nominated for all these awards. And it really just, snowballs into a long career for Sylvester Stallone. And that kind of takes us into Rocky II.
Win, He wants to bury you. He wants to humiliate you. He wants to prove to the whole world that it was nothing but some kind of a freak the first time out.
Rocky, his whole life was a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, but he's about to show the world he's 1 in a million.
Why don't you stand up and fight this guy hard like you done before? That was beautiful.
Rocky II, The story continues.
What's interesting about what you mentioned, Alex, is that these Rocky films do kind of mirror Sylvester Stallone's life. After the success of Rocky, Stallone had made a couple of films. One was known as Fist, which kind of takes place back in the 30s. Have you seen that film
have not.
before? It's like a labor union film. It's a drama. It did okay. He does another film called Paradise Alley, where it's kind of, again, set back in kind of the 30s or 40s, I believe, and he actually plays like a wrestler, and it's a drama. The interesting thing about those two films is that they didn't do very well commercially. And Rocky, Sylvester Stallone, goes back to the Rocky story again with Rocky 2. And what's interesting about Rocky 2 is, of course, it's a hit. It picks up where Rocky, the first one, left off. But Stallone and, in a sense, Rocky prove that they're not a one-hit wonder.
Absolutely.
Because think about it. Stallone's thinking, I'm a star now. He makes a couple of films. They don't do that well. He goes back to what made him successful, and in a way, metaphorically, to see, geez, I wonder if I'm just a one-hit wonder, or am I able to go back to that successful well again? And
Yeah,
he
both
does.
both Rocky and Stallone had something to prove to themselves.
Yeah, they did. He gets another shot at success. Stallone does, and so does Rocky. And of course, we know in Rocky 2, as the story progresses, he and Adrian become married. He's got some vision problems in one of his eyes, and that's kind of the catalyst, I guess you could say, or the conflict within the film is, could he handle another bout with Apollo Creed?
The doctor said you shouldn't fight anymore.
You recommended I don't fight, and I recommend that I do.
The challenge.
I want all of America, I want the whole world to see me destroy this man after 2 short rounds.
Rocky, do you think you have a chance this time against Apollo?
I don't know, it looks pretty bad.
Their first child is born. Adrian is kind of in a pregnancy coma. I don't know what you call it. I know there's a little bit of a story behind that with actress Talia Shire as to why she was kind of bedridden the whole time. But, it really does. They've told the Rocky Adrian story in Rocky 1, so it's kind of nice that she's, this is more focusing on Rocky. And of course, even in the story of Rocky 2, he retires and he tries to get into commercials and tries to get other jobs. And people keep telling him, I hear you're a good boxer. Maybe you should go back into boxing. And Rocky 2 does stand up very well.
I agree. It's a sequel that it was pretty darn good.
It is. It's a sequel that really sticks to the success and tone of the first one. And as we get to the end of Rocky 2, there's another exciting fight. Of course, Rocky wins the title, and this is where Rocky 2 is going to end and propel us into not only a new generation, but we're going to say goodbye to the 70s. And we're going to enter an interesting time period of Rocky films, the 1980s. And this is why I like to mention how Rocky 1 and 2 are very similar in tone, kind of a slow drama that's still a very interesting and great movie, but more of a character film. And then we get into Rocky 3 and 4, which, don't get me wrong, freaking awesome films.
Love them.
But tonally, they are so different. Welcome to the MTV era.
It is quintessential 80s films.
So, obviously, you all have seen Rocky 3, and if you haven't, stop this podcast right now and go watch it.
Now, when we fought, you had that eye of the tiger, man, the edge. And now you got to get it back. And the way to get it back is to go back to the beginning. You know what I mean?
United Artists and Chartoff Winkler proudly present Rocky 3.
I remember seeing Rocky 3 in the theater with my dad and my grandfather and possibly my brother. I can't really remember. Loving it, loving it, loving it, loving it. Of course, I was born in the 70s, but I'm really kind of a child of the 80s. So this was around the time where, we're into MTV. This is 1983, which, by the way, I will want to say that Stallone had made some other films that were pretty successful. And of course, he had made First Blood, I think a year before, and kind of started that new franchise of Rambo. And if you're going to talk a little bit about Rocky 3 and how it kind of mirrors Rocky and Stallone's success, well, Rocky 3 starts off with a great montage, Eye of the Tiger, and it's showing Rocky with all of his fame. He's got the title, he's got the money, he's got the cars. Of course, he and Adrian are still married. He's got guest appearances on the Muppet Show and things like that. And what's interesting about, Stallone's life is now he is back on top. He's got Rocky 3, he's got the new Rambo franchise up and running, and Stallone himself is kind of adjusting to fame and fortune and success and keeping his edge. And that really is what the theme of Rocky 3 is about, is Rocky dealing with success, keeping his edge, fame, fortune, and all that.
The worst thing happened to you that could happen to any fighter. You got civilized. Get out of here with you!
The truth is, we both started out on the same corner, and I got lucky with my life, and it's driving you nuts.
Philadelphia salutes its favorite son, Rocky Balboa.
Well, it mirrors the 80s extremely well in terms of what was going on in America.
Talk about that a little bit.
The 80s take off. We've kind of recovered from the Vietnam era, kind of Watergate's done. We've moved past Jimmy Carter, just kind of some of the things that took place in the 70s. And we're nearing the end of the Cold War in the 80s. And America itself is trying to keep its edge. What is America going to do to stay on top? Because we're at this culmination where ever since 1945, it's been the United States and the Soviets. Spoiler alert, here comes Rocky IV. But it's been the United States and the Soviets. And what is the United States going to do to maintain its edge, to maintain its place in the world, if you will? The 80s begins. We see, obviously, a very lively decade, if you will. But it's what is America doing in order to stay on top? Because America kind of bounced back after the Vietnam War, and then the 80s happen. We see the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, begin to be put in place by the Reagan administration. Far-fetched idea that really was impossible to put into practice.
Yeah.
But again, it's an idea of what all is the United States doing to get ahead, to stay on top, especially stay on top from those pesky commies.
The pesky commies, yes. And one of the great standouts of Rocky III, by the way, is, of course, Mr. T. This is his
B.A. Baracus, right?
B.A. Baracus.
Hey, why don't you tell all these nice folks why you've been ducking me?
This guy is a wrecking machine.
You got a big mouth.
Why don't you come out and close it, Balboa? Come on.
I want to fight this guy.
You fight him without me.
Balboa was a fine champion, but his time has passed.
See that look in their eyes, Rock? Gotta get that look back, Rock. Eye of the Tiger, come on.
I will destroy any man who tries to take what I got. I'm gonna torture him. I'm gonna crucify him real bad.
And this is his breakout role. And, the story of Mr. T itself, him being like a bouncer for certain celebrities and kind of is making his way through the bar circuit of being like a personal bodyguard, this, that, and the other. He was just perfect for the role. It was a perfect time. And this culminates what I remember as my introduction to Hulk Hogan. Thunderlips, the ultimate male versus the ultimate meatball.
He was a real American.
He was a real American.
The wrestling champion of the world is now entering the arena, and I'm telling you, he is quite a sight, all decked out in red.
Why are they carrying him? He's walking.
I'm coming after you, Balboa.
Let's call it off.
Oh, come on, it's for charity.
You're wearing your anatomy out for charity. Nobody else does this much for charity.
Bob Hope would.
That's true.
And what's great, I think what's brilliant about Stallone is the fact that he works into the script, because it does fit pretty well. Boxer versus wrestler. It's been done before. Gorilla Monsoon took on Muhammad Ali. Back in the day, you had numerous boxers that would get in the ring with Andre the Giant. And this was a great move by Stallone to add a little element of wrestling into this script, because this is just right on the cusp of when the WWF, now known as the WWE, was going to explode onto the scene. And as you'll obviously see, if you followed any of the WrestleManias, the fame of Mr. T and the pairing of Hulk Hogan kind of bring together that whole thing, like the rock and wrestling era, what we want to call it. Just a great scene. It's all fake, meatball. I mean, just perfect. But what's also interesting about Mr. T is he's kind of a one-dimensional character, Clubber Lang, but we don't know much about him at all. And this is where we kind of the Rocky films kind of take a turn for 3 and 4, where the villain, if you will, is just kind of thrown in there.
The villain is a muscular guy that knows how to beat the tar out of people.
Yeah, basically. And Rocky 3 is the end of an era when you talk about Mickey's death. And still, I think, a powerful scene. I know some people, they kind of give Stallone a hard time in that scene where he's crying and wailing, and gosh, but when you love these characters as much as we do, it's kind of emotional.
There's a bond. There's a bond between Rocky and Mickey, obviously. Mickey could have been the father figure for Rocky, for all we know, and probably was at a very pivotal time in Rocky's life where he's getting married, having a kid. Mickey might be that elder guidance that Rocky needs. So it is an emotional time for him.
And it is, I think it's the perfect time for, obviously, Burgess Meredith was still around and he could have been in another Rocky film, but you got to move the story forward. And this is just like we see in other films where the mentor has to go and let the student fully develop, and Rocky is going to fully develop. Of course, he loses the fight to Clubber Lang, and this is our first Rocky film where we actually have 2 boxing matches, and it's such a plot that you see this formula in other films. In fact, not to get off topic, but when I talk about The Dark Knight Rises, kind of the third in the Dark Knight series, I always joked of it as the Batman Rocky 3. Because if you think about it, not to get into The Dark Knight, but Batman gets his back broken, he goes away, he's going to get trained, and then he's going to come back, and it's
except we know how Rocky got back to the arena. We don't know how Batman got into Gotham.
We don't. But Rocky 3 has got the perfect formula. And of course, as we mentioned, this is the MTV era, and I know I said it once before, but we're getting into the soundtrack of, The Eye of the Tiger. We're getting into the 80s soundtracks that, of course, are going to be a huge part of films, not only with Rocky IV, we'll get to that, but, Top Gun and Footloose. And this is the MTV era, and not that the 70s didn't have soundtracks, but other than, Saturday Night Fever of the 70s, I can't think of a lot of huge soundtracks that were around like what the 80s gave us.
Well, yeah, in the 80s, if you want to get something done in a movie or a sitcom, anything on TV, you can get it done in a 30-second power montage where...
You gotta have a montage.
I think it's a filmmaking 101 in the 1980s. Does your film contain a montage?
To get from point A to point B really fast, what do? Montage.
Call Survivor, have them write a song,
and of course that was their biggest hit, and they would return, of course, in Rocky IV. Rocky III wins the title, defeats Clubber Lang. We never see him again.
No, never heard of again.
What? Yeah. I guess sometimes that happens in boxing. I would have liked to have seen Clubber in maybe some of the later films, but who knows? All right, well, I think anything else on Rocky III?
I think Rocky III is pretty well summed up. I think it's time to move to
the most unlikeliest of films to end the Cold War.
Today, the Soviet Union has officially entered professional boxing.
This is not just an exhibition fight. Look, this is us against them.
He would like to compete against anyone who's qualified.
Drago is the most perfectly trained athlete ever. Whatever he hits, he destroys.
I don't know what to think about Rocky IV. When I first saw it, I was just hooked from the very beginning. Not only was the opening titles the first time that they didn't use the Rocky theme, they used Eye of the Tiger as you see those missile gloves turn to face each other with the American flag and the Soviet flag on each glove. And of course, they take off and crash in perfect 80s fashion and blow up. A little bit of what's going on in the 80s with the Cold War. In the 1980, the U.S. and allies boycott the Summer Olympics in Moscow. 84, you've got the Soviets now boycotting our Olympics in Los Angeles, the Summer Olympics. And then we get Mikhail Gorbachev, 1985, becoming leader of the Soviet Union. 86, you've got the Chernobyl disaster. Soviet nuclear power plant in the Ukraine explodes, resulting in the worst nuclear power plant accident in history. And that, of course, that's when the rest of the world was saying, hey, can we help you out with this? No, nothing to see here. Nothing happening here. 1987, we get one of probably Alex Winkler's best moments. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
It's a fantastic moment in presidential history.
Of course, very famous and important. 87, we get the continued nuclear arms reduction talks and treaties that essentially start bringing the end to the Cold War. But we know, Alex, what ended the Cold War.
It was Rocky IV.
Yeah, there was no negotiations going on. It took one single boxing match in Mother Russia.
Has the fight date been set yet?
December 25th.
Where?
It's in Russia.
Are you nuts?
Miss Balboa, when will you be going to Russia?
I'm not going to Russia. I don't know what you're talking about.
He's had one professional fight, and one man is dead.
Tabibi, he's going to have to kill me.
Why can't you change your thinking?
Because I'm a fighter.
You can't win!
It is interesting to note some of the other Cold War films of the 80s at the times, because this is such a weird turn for Rocky, not so much in the franchise, but literally this film is just focused on the Cold War. You've had other films like Invasion USA by Chuck Norris. Rambo 3, of course, was coming out, and Rambo 2 was coming out around the same time as Rocky 4. War Games, Top Gun, Red Dawn. Wolverines, yes. This was a true time period to catch on to that Cold War theme again, kind of what we saw in the 50s, and wrap your plots around these ideas. So what's interesting about Rocky IV is, again, Stallone, when writing the story, looked back in history, and he based it on yet another real boxing match, Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling, the 1936 bout, and of course their rematch in 1938. So if any of you know this history, it's pretty interesting. Max Schmeling, of course, was a German boxer who refused to be part of the Nazi Party. Joe Louis, of course, the great American champion. They had their first bout in 1936, where Max Schmeling was able to knock out Joe Louis. Are you familiar with this story at all, Alex?
Only slightly.
Okay, well, what's interesting about Max Schmeling actually did something that no other boxer was really doing at the time. He was looking at footage of Joe Louis boxing. He actually used newsreel footage to see how Joe Louis boxed and what he did when he would throw a punch, how he would lower this way or that way. And Max Schmeling actually used what you would call film, what we call video today, to actually study his opponent. And that's where he got an upper hand, was able to knock out Joe Louis, I think, in the second round. Now, of course, in true Rocky fashion, they have a rematch 2 years later where Max Schmeling was knocked out by Joe Louis. It was, of course, Nazi Germany versus the United States, oppression versus freedom, totalitarianism versus democracy. And of course, that's what we're going to get in this film with Rocky IV, is communism versus democracy. And just on a quick side note, Max Schmeling, who I said would refuse to embrace the Nazi Party and the idea, was kind of shunned for his behavior. He lived a full life. In fact, he only died just a few years ago. And he and Joe Louis actually became close friends. And so that's a nice, happy kind of Rocky story there. But just some real history that was tied into this idea of Rocky IV and getting the communist versus the Americans. So this movie, in my class, we've watched this before. You look at that pro-American propaganda in Rocky IV. What I have my students, for instance, look for is right from the opening credits, I mentioned the missile gloves. Right there, it just kind of sets the tone. This ideological battle between democracy and communism. Do you know the story about Dolph Lundgren, about his character from the first film? Or from this first draft of the screenplay?
No, I do not. Tell me.
Well, Dolph Lundgren had a lot more dialogue. He had much more dialogue in the film. As you know from watching this movie, and maybe you haven't counted, I think he only says about 9 words, if even
not
more.
much.
It's not much at all. What's interesting is it was Dolph Lundgren's idea as he approached Stallone to portray Ivan Drago as more of like a machine.
Well, it does dehumanize his character by not speaking.
Right, exactly. He is more of a machine, a robot. Just that look on his face. Again, dehumanizing him. And so, in a sense, you get a little bit of an undertone of you've got Rocky, the good old American Rocky fighter, versus this man who's not really even a man. He's more of a machine. His mannerisms, his characteristics, the stares. That is one of the frightening things about Ivan Drago is not only is he physically intimidating, but of course, just the fact that he is one of those guys that doesn't have to say a lot to get the job done in the ring.
Mm-hmm.
That brings us to some of the other elements of this film. The fight scene between Apollo Creed and Ivan Drago. I mean, what can you say about that? The exhibition fight.
Well, Apollo, the last fight we hear about with Apollo is losing to Rocky in Rocky II. And Apollo's a competitor. He was used to, for several years, being on top. Then Rocky kind of knocked him, but they became friends afterwards. So they patched things up. And Apollo is an essential character in 3 and 4 for the storyline to continue to develop. Creed has no business going back into the ring. You don't see him train. We talked about that earlier. And it was heavily stressed over and over and over again that it was an exhibition fight.
Exhibition fight.
It was supposed to be for fun, just a little bit of a showcase, but Apollo truly believes that he's going to just push Drago around the ring.
Well, and in true American fashion, we get this extravagant Las Vegas type fight scene, which of course involves the late great
James Brown.
Yes. I'll be editing that part out. We get the late great James Brown living in America. And you know what's interesting about Living in America? That was his first #1 hit.
Really?
James Brown had a lot of hits, but the highest song to climb on the charts was Living in America. And what's interesting about this scene too is I kind of pointed out, that's one of the questions that I ask my students is, what do you think this scene says about the United States? Well, extravagance, over the top, kind of you Americans always overdressing for the wrong occasions. That that line from Raiders of the Lost Ark. But we love it. We're Americans. We love the freedom.
We're
democracy.
dancing along.
Yeah,
we're like,
dancing
this
along.
is awesome.
But Drago, just the look on his face is like, what is going on here? And he is determined. But I think that just says kind of a lot about just the different ideologies. I don't think there's anything wrong with the extravagance that we see in the film, but from Stallone's point of view, he's kind of making a point that it's not going to be a show. It's not going to be a show that turns out the way that you think it's going to turn out.
Maybe the same way a war with Russia is not going to be the flashy, the glorious conquest. We tend to romanticize war from the past.
Yes.
We romanticize. World War II is America's favorite war.
Yeah.
And obviously, they're the noble cause of defeating Nazi Germany, and we can spend hours on that too. But war with the Soviet Union, the other most powerful nation on earth, is not going to be a flashy James Brown singing affair.
No, it's not. And in fact, by this time in like 1984, we've had films like The Day After, that movie that appeared on regular television that really scared the heck out of everyone. We're still getting, like I mentioned, films that aren't so exactly, fiction. Invasion USA and things like that are fun to watch in the Rambo films, but this very much was a serious matter and a real threat when you talk about the threat of nuclear war. One thing that I also want to point out about Ivan Drago's character is we mentioned that in this film, with his lack of dialogue and his intimidating posture and size and his stares and glances, and he very much is robotic. And I do want to focus a little bit on what the heck is a robot doing in this film. And when I say robot, I mean the actual robot that's given to Polly as a Christmas gift.
Yes. Happy birthday, Polly.
Happy birthday, Polly. You know what's funny about the 80s is we just talked about some of the other films, but the 80s were, of course, robot heavy as far as films are concerned. Some of them that I like to talk about, or maybe we'll talk about in future podcasts, like RoboCop, The Terminator, Transformers movie came out, the animated one. You've got Short Circuit 1 and 2. You've got Blade Runner, which, those are replicants, but, kind of robotic. You've got Batteries Not Included, Runaway. There's just a lot of films that are kind of including these elements of robots. But what's interesting about the robot in Rocky IV is it was actually Sylvester Stallone's robot that he had purchased for his son, who was autistic. And they decided, of course, to use it in the film. And I think, again, it's just because robots were kind of the craze. It's just weird. It's just a weird...
It's the 80s.
Yeah, it's just the 80s. You watch that movie now and you're like, a robot? It's the 80s. It's kind of the excuse. Going back to, of course, the dance number. Is that what we call it nowadays? The dance.
I think so. The dance number.
The James Brown Living in America is nothing more than an MTV video.
Sure.
And is this film really just a long music video?
It seems like that, because it seems like as soon as one music video ends, we go to commercial, which is the dialogue of the film, and then we get back to another montage.
Yeah, we get back to another montage. Oh, and of course, Apollo Creed dies in the ring.
Yeah, we can't gloss over that fact that the Russian is this overpowering. You watch him before the fight. That I remember the scene where they're showing the normal punching power of a human, and it's I believe they say it's 750 pounds per square inch.
Yeah.
And then Drago punches 1850.
Something like that.
So
yeah.
over double. And so, it's building him up, and Apollo's dancing around the ring, and he slips very early on in the fight.
Yep.
Apollo's known for his grace in the ring, slips in the fight, and Rocky refuses to throw in the towel.
Yeah. Speaking of the fights, there are some funny little short stories about those fight scenes. Apparently, Apollo Creed, during that fight, when Drago grabs him and throws him into the corner of the ring, that was kind of unscripted. And from what I understand, Carl Weathers was not happy about that.
No, Stallone actually had to talk him back into the scene of the movie, even because Dolph Lundgren, physically is just a specimen.
And you wonder how much of that is true or not. But the fact that you read about it and you hear about the stories, and not only that, but the authenticity of the fight scenes Rocky or Stallone wanted, they were actually punching each other. And as you've heard before, you may have heard the scene where Dolph Lundgren had punched Rocky in the chest, causing some tears in the muscles and possibly some heart problems. He was in the hospital, I think, for 8 days or something like that. That's just the brutality of making a boxing movie. So Apollo Creed dies, and of course, like you said, Rocky's going to accept the challenge. He's going to avenge his friend's death, and he confronts Adrian again. We get into another MTV music video, Roger Tepper, There's No Easy Way Out. What a great scene. Just gets in his car and drives as we're looking at flashbacks. What's funny about Rocky IV is as the movie progresses, you're thinking, montage, dialogue, like you said, montage, dialogue, training montage. We're now at the end of the film with the fight. But the montages themselves, the training montages are interesting. Rocky ends up training in Russia, flying over there. It's really Montana, I think, or Wyoming,
Jackson
or something
Hole,
like that.
I believe.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, you can't. Why would you pack up everybody to go to Russia? You can just go to the north of the United States. But I think even going back to the tone and ideologies of these films, you've got the robot, the Russian monster that's kind of in this technology-enhanced training environment, and then you've got good old American initiative, which is
chopping logs, climbing up mountains
doing
covered in
sit-ups
snow,
in a barn,
growing your beard out,
growing beards, and it's very much American machismo, I would say. And then, of course, we get to the fight. And by the way, before I forget to mention this, Alex, we need to tell people, stop what you're doing after this podcast and get on YouTube and watch the mockumentary 30 for 30 on Rocky IV.
It's fantastic.
It
I
is
think called How
hilarious.
Rocky Ended the Cold War.
It's
Balboa Ends the Cold War.
It's
Something
about
like
8 or
that.
10 minutes, and it is just brilliant. If you watch 30 for 30s, this is one that they actually, I believe, did on Rocky and treated it as if it was a real event to end the Cold War. It is just
You mean
brilliant.
this wasn't a real event? to end
Oh,
the
yeah.
Cold-
Sorry, man behind the curtain here. Yes, it was. But as you know, we know how the film ends. Rocky is victorious. Not to steal some of the thunder from the 30 by 30, but miraculously the crowd starts supporting Rocky.
On Christmas Day in the
Rocky,
Soviet Union,
Rocky.
the crowd turns to support an American.
Yeah, by the way, people often ask, what's your favorite Christmas film? I think I'm going to start saying Rocky IV.
I agree. It
I
takes
mean,
place on Christmas Day.
absolutely. What a better day than to end the Cold War as a Christmas gift. So we know how this film ends with Rocky knocking out the impossible opponent of Ivan Drago. Rocky gives his speech, and the Cold War ends.
I was trying to say is that if I can change,
Я думаю, что каждый тоже изменился
and
сегодня.
you can change,
Вы можете измениться.
everybody can change.
Каждый может измениться.
And we move into a period of time where Stallone is on top of the world. He is making more and more films that are successful. He gets an idea for Rocky V, where believe it or not, Rocky V's initial idea was to deal with the brain damage that this fight. How many punches they land?
I believe it was like close to 90% of their power punches they landed in the fight.
Yeah, exactly.
Something just absurd. No
Yeah.
defense at all
No
whatsoever.
defense. But on a serious note, they were going to tackle the brain damage issue, and that's originally the idea came from Rocky and Ivan Drago dealing with that. And instead, we got Rocky V, which I will say that must have been Sylvester Stallone's dream when he was on the flight home after the fight. I've literally eliminated Rocky V from my from my franchise.
Yeah,
like most people
kind of
have.
have to. Yeah, move on, move past.
Exactly, move past. And that does lead us to what's known as Rocky Balboa. It's kind of the bookend of this franchise. Of course, Stallone has an appearance in Creed, and we're not going to talk about that today, even though it's awesome. But to end the Rocky franchise, it's really a great bookend. I love Rocky Balboa.
It's closure.
It is closure. Some people may think, like I did walking in, are you kidding me? Rocky's going to get into the ring again? But, you know, when you look at real life fighters like George Foreman and others that actually got into the ring at an older age and stood toe to toe.
It's ingrained in the boxer's nature, I believe. And
Absolutely.
It's ingrained in Rocky's nature to never give up. So it doesn't matter if he's 65 years old.
Yeah, and I think it is a great story to tell. One of the things that's interesting about mirroring Stallone's life is that at the time, Stallone's career had kind of taken a downturn. He was doing a lot of what you call like straight-to-video movies. He went back to MGM, had an idea for a small Rocky film, small budget, and it became a hit. And it did revitalize Stallone's career. He made The Expendables. He got into some other films. But what I love about Rocky Balboa is the idea that he's got something still in the tank and he just wants to prove to himself that he can do it. Adrian's gone. I still get choked up at that scene where he's talking to Paulie and Paulie's like, tell me about the stuff. And Stallone himself, I think, he does a really great job of holding back, his pain, his sadness, but also trying to let go of that anger.
What? You haven't peaked yet?
Peaked?
Yeah, peaked.
I don't know, there's still some stuff in the basement.
What basement?
In here.
Tell me about the stuff.
What about it?
Tell me about the stuff inside. Is it angry?
Angry?
Are you mad because Adrian left you?
She didn't leave, Paul. She died.
Okay.
Sometimes it's hard to breathe. I feel like this beast inside me.
It's okay, Rocco. Please, it's okay.
Is it? Okay. I just never knew it was supposed to be this hard. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Paul,
And one of the best inspirational speeches of probably any film, when Rocky is confronting his son, who's a little bit embarrassed about his dad going back into the ring and not being able to let go of boxing. Such a great scene.
You ain't gonna believe this. Well, you used to fit right here. I'd hold you up and say to your mother, this kid's gonna be the best kid in the world. This kid's gonna be somebody better than anybody ever knew. And you grew up good and wonderful. It was great just watching you every day. It was like a privilege. Then the time come for you to be your own man and take on the world, and you did. But somewhere along the line, you changed. You stopped being you. You let people stick a finger in your face and tell you you're no good. And when things got hard, you started looking for something to blame, like a big shadow. Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. Now, if you know what you're worth, now go out and get what you're worth. But you gotta be willing to take the hits and not pointing fingers saying you ain't where you wanna be because of him or her or anybody. Cowards do that, and that ain't you. You're better than that.
And of course, that closed out the Rocky films, the movie. See Rocky Balboa if you haven't. Again, it's a great ending to the franchise, especially that last fight. The whole point is not winning the fight. It's, again, getting back into the ring and trying to prove that you can do something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that really does kind of end the Rocky franchise. As far as, Creed goes, great film. Check it out. Creed 2 is going to be coming out. Sylvester Stallone, actually, I just heard, stepped down from directing that film. He wanted to get more of a perspective of a younger filmmaker, since that's what the focus of the film really is. But any last thoughts on Rocky, the franchise?
It's one of those franchises that will stand the test of time because the message of it does not go away. It's relatable to people, no matter if you saw it when it first came out in the 70s or you're a kid right now and somehow you're listening to this podcast because you found your way to a weird section of iTunes called History Through Film. And there's something in it for everybody. It's relatable for all generations, all ages. They're rewatchable.
It is. It's very rewatchable. In fact, like with some of my students, I'll ask them, have you ever seen the original Rocky? Well, I watched 3 and 4. Oh, well, let's watch and see where it all started from. So, well, guys, I hope you enjoyed listening to our Rocky podcast. I think we touched about on everything that we could in this particular podcast. Once again, yeah, we're on iTunes now. Please get on there, subscribe, like us, rate us. If you like what you're hearing, reach out to us. You can find me on Twitter at History Through Film. That's History, THRU, Film. If you want to reach out, ask us a question, maybe suggest a film that we're going to do in the future, we'd be more than happy to do that. Alex, thanks for joining me again.
Well, thank you for having me.
And you will hear Alex again on some other podcasts as we move forward. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you later.